And good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is
Morning.
Don K.
What?
Preston. I'm the
What do you
president.
say? Morning
What did
musings.
I say?
Did you say
Did I
morning
say morning
musings?
musings? uh, Geez. Okay, let me back up here. We'll just carry right on. Welcome back to Two Guys in a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. Yeah, it's already been quite a week. Been a great week. My wife and I don't know what to say. But my wife and I celebrated our 53rd wedding anniversary yesterday. I took the
Congratulations.
day off. Thank you. I took the day off. She took the day sort of kind of off. And when you take time off out of your regular schedule, all of a sudden you don't even know what time it is.
No.
You don't know what day it is. And that's kind of the way I've been all day long. Even though you and I talked and I told you, okay, we're not gonna do the filming on Monday as usual. My internal clock just didn't assimilate that and let me know, hey, Don, this is where you're at. This is not more. Anyway, your internet connection is unstable. Well, we hope that corrects itself. So, anyway, good to be with you here on Two Guys in a Bible.
There you go.
That is Daniel Rogers, unless I have a case of mistaken identity going on here.
Hey, that's me.
So good to see you again, Daniel.
Good to see you too. And you do have a little bit of an unstable internet connection. I see on your little bars down here. It keeps going to the red, and then your whole thing freezes up and makes you lag. But I can still hear you. So just keep talking. And if for some reason I can't hear you, I'll wave you down
Okay.
and stop the program or whatever. Put a pause on it. So
I may have to reboot. Possibly, I haven't. I literally haven't rebooted my computer in like forever.
oh yeah.
So it's possible that it needs to have a good purging.
Sure.
But
I can keep the
we'll
troops
keep going.
entertained if you need to.
There you go. Yeah. Well, we wanted to continue this week on a subject we introduced a couple of weeks ago, I think it was, uh, entitled Temple Eschatology. Now, Daniel and I have been talking about the Messianic Temple. The Messianic Temple it is a spiritual reality of which we as children of God are a part. God dwells in us, we dwell in him. So, that being true, and of course, we're ultimately going to focus on that aspect of it even more than we have. But one of the things that is really actually embedded in so many of the prophecies of the coming Messianic temple, those prophecies found in the Old Testament. Embedded in those prophecies were predictions of the destruction of the old covenant temple, the the temple made with hands, as it were. And it's been absolutely amazing to me, Daniel, as I really getting into the literature. My books are in boxes stashed away in, a storage building here and a storage building there and a bedroom here and, scattered,
Yeah.
scattered to the winds. But nonetheless, I've been able to dig a few of them out. And I've always got logos, Bible study programs. So I've been doing what is absolutely, I mean, literally stunning to me is that so few, and by so few, I mean basically nobody, makes the connection that the eschatological consummation, the day of the Lord, the judgment, was to occur at the time of the judgment on the old covenant temple. Now, I have one book in my library. It's big, thick book, and it is the eschatological significance of the temple in Isaiah 65 Isaiah 66. And I have to admit, I haven't read the whole thing yet. What I remember reading from it was rather insightful. But here's the critical missing link. Even in those commentators who make mention of eschatology and the temple, and again, and look, I haven't found any of them that dwell on this issue. I just simply haven't found any. But even more glaring than that is the fact that nobody, not one commentary that I have surveyed, makes any mention whatsoever. And this is the amazing, this is the revolutionary, this is the unessayed aspect of what I am calling temple eschatology. The Bible is quite clear that the eschatological consummation would be at the time of the destruction of the first century temple that was standing in the days of Jesus, that was standing when Hebrews was written, that was standing when Paul wrote his epistles. Now that's really the revolutionary part. You know, as preterists, we have focused on the fact, and rightfully so, that biblical eschatology is about the fulfillment of God's old covenant promises made to old covenant Israel, and that the New Testament writers are very clear that it was to happen in their generation. But I don't recall a single preterist. Maybe you can call some to mind here when I finally shut up in a moment. But I don't remember reading a single preterist who pointed out that the New Testament is quite clear that it was to be the first century temple, standing when Jesus taught, standing when Hebrews was written, etc. That was to be standing and valid and binding at the time of the judgment, the parousia, the resurrection. So, are you aware of anyone that has essayed on that particular aspect?
Not maybe to the extent that you're planning on doing in your book. Just, comments on Hebrews 9, especially the passage you keep alluding to. The present time and leading up to the diorthosis in Hebrews 9, and perhaps maybe some specific comments about Luke 21, these stones, not one of these stones. So I've heard those, minor comments made, but nothing as extensive as you're alluding to, right now.
Well, it really is. To me, this is this whole issue of temple eschatology and what I will also label as priesthood eschatology, which are obviously interwoven with one another. You can't talk about the Jerusalem temple without talking about the priesthood, at least not properly. So this entire discussion is really a refinement, a more closely defining discussion of what I mentioned a moment ago, and that is that preterists rightly emphasize the relationship between Old Covenant Israel and eschatology. But I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, as preterists, we hear the very thing that you mentioned, these stones, not do you see these things, not
Right.
one stone shall be left standing. Yes, I understand, though, but those are not discussions that have ever been, to my knowledge, and again, I may have missed something. That's certainly always possible. Those have never been the focus of a lengthy discussion. Here's what this means for eschatology.
Right.
Now,
Right.
I don't know anybody that denies that Jesus predicted the destruction of that very first century temple. Nobody denies that. Well, yeah, but admitting that is not admitting to the temple eschatology,
Right.
because all millennialists say, well, yeah, he predicted the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, but that wasn't his coming. That wasn't the end of the age. Postmillennialists say the same thing. Dispensationalists say Well, yeah, the temple's got to be rebuilt after the coming of the Lord, after the second coming. So even though the dispensationalists put an awful lot of emphasis on temple, and matter of fact, in the dispensational paradigm, they have what they like to call the Antichrist temple. Immediately after the rapture, Israel signs a peace treaty with the Antichrist, with the man of sin. He allows them to rebuild the temple. This is the Antichrist temple. I don't think anybody would argue that's the Messianic temple.
No.
I don't think they'd want to go there. Okay, so then in the midst of the week, that temple is destroyed. And then another temple is built. Now, this depends upon who you read in the dispensational circles.
Well, wait a minute.
This is not a prominent part of dispensationalism. Yeah.
All this money and building supplies and things like that. And now, is that for the Antichrist temple or the Messianic temple? And who's to say which?
I have yet to get a dispensationalist to just come right out and to say, well, yeah, all of the money being raised right now and all of the materials that have been gathered, yeah, that's for the Antichrist temple because that's the first temple to be rebuilt. That's kind of a sticky wicket to use the term, but in their paradigm, the Antichrist temple is the next temple to be built. There's no question about that. Now, as I mentioned, depending on who you're reading in the dispensational world, the Antichrist temple is destroyed in the middle of the 7-week tribulation. And then, once again, depending on who you read, it's believed that there'll be another temple, or in the majority view of dispensationalism, to the very best I can determine, after the destruction of the Antichrist temple, you have a 3.5-year interlude, pardon me, of the Great Tribulation, no temple, and the Jews are on the verge of being destroyed. They cry out to Jesus as he comes out of heaven, saves them, and then he rebuilds the temple. Now, if you were to ask your normal run-of-the-mill, shall we say, dispensationalists, they would say, oh, yeah, see, all this good stuff that we're setting aside right now, that's for that temple. It's just part of, I would call this a real embarrassing aspect of dispensationalism, because they don't want to talk, even though it's in their writing, it's very explicit in dispensational writing. The next temple to be rebuilt is the temple that Antichrist allows them to build. It's all by his authority. It is therefore a sinner's temple, the man of sin's temple. But it's got to be done away with in order to get the Messianic temple. That's dispensationalism. It has 2 more temples. It has at least 3 more resurrections. Some say 5. And all the more you dig into dispensationalism, the more complicated, the more technical, the more complex the system is. But not to discuss dispensationalism tonight, because I really, really, really want to focus on, again, what I have called and what I am labeling temple eschatology. And let me be very, very clear, once again, about what I'm proposing, ladies and gentlemen. While no one denies that Jesus foretold the destruction of the temple that was to occur in his generation, no question about it. While no one denies that that temple was destroyed in that generation, everyone denies that the judgment, the parousia, and the coming of the Lord, or excuse me, the resurrection, occurred at that time. Now, everybody denies that except the preterists. And yet again, I have not preterists who have essayed temple eschatology, in the way that I'm seeing it, in the way that I'm interpreting it, in the way that I'm understanding it. And I have not found anybody who has essayed temple eschatology in the way that I'm seeing it, in the way that I'm interpreting it. And I have not found anybody who has essayed temple eschatology in the way that I'm seeing it, in the way that I'm understanding it. I'm essaying it right now in this book that I'm currently working on. And here's what I mean. Not only does the Old Testament predict the destruction of Israel, not only does it predict the end of the Old Covenant law, and by the way, I'm reading a really, really fascinating article right now, something to paraphrase the title, Daniel 9:27, and an inquiry into the relationship of the end of the law in the New Testament. Yeah, and interestingly enough, it was written by an Adventist guy. So I'm only about halfway through, and I'll be really, really honest. His analysis, I don't understand all those terms. So nonetheless, after he analyzes the Hebrew, then he'll say, "Well, here's what this means." And I'm going, "Oh, okay. Why didn't you say so?" And so I'm only a little, not quite halfway into the article. 21 particularly as the time of the fulfillment of Daniel 9:27 and the end of the law. So I can't wait to dig through his Hebrew linguistic analysis to get down to his theological analysis to where he draws his conclusion. So far, I've been able to wade through enough of it to go, okay, that's pretty good stuff right there. So I was tickled to find the article.
Yeah.
I will. It is. It's interesting to see people beginning to wake up to that concept and that idea, and it's particularly interesting to see an Adventist waking up to that concept. Okay, so here's what I want to emphasize. As I've already mentioned, I've repeated this. I don't know of anyone that is laying the focus on the fact that both the Old Testament and the New teach us that it was not just the temple that was to be destroyed at the coming of the Lord in judgment of Jerusalem. Now, that would be quite enough, to be honest about it. But that would not be specific enough, and it would not be as specific as the Scripture truly presents the case. Now, as one case study, last week we looked at Isaiah chapter 24 and chapter 25. In Isaiah 24, we have the destruction of heaven and earth. We have the destruction of the people who dwelt in the city in the midst of the land. And that can be no other people, no other city, no other land than the land and the city and the people of Israel, Jerusalem. And it would be at that time that the city and the temple would be destroyed. And then it says, in that day, well, what day? The day of the destruction of the city and the temple. In that day, the Lord of hosts shall make on this mountain a feast of fine things, a feast of wine on the lees, a feast of fat things. This is a messianic banquet. Where is it posited? In that day of the destruction of the city and the temple. That's temple eschatology exemplified, even magnified. The same thing, and we're getting, Daniel asked me before the program, what are we gonna do? And I said, Isaiah 66. Well, we're gonna get there. But I want you to notice, and let's spend a little bit of time here. Let me get my Bible over here. Like I said, with the way everything is arranged now in my house with our construction ongoing and what have you, and got a little bit excited. They were doing the striping and the mudding yesterday and today, and so it's kind of getting down there to that point where things are going to get at least hopefully, they're going to go very, very quickly.
Right.
And I was talking to someone on the phone just a little bit ago, and they said, well, should you be in the next 2 weeks? I said, no, we're probably a good month away yet, because even though they'll start spraying and painting, et cetera, none of the light fixtures are in. None of the final details are in. They've still got all of the moldings and this, everything that goes along with it. So we're still a good little ways off, but the end is approaching.
There you go.
We can see the day approaching. We really can.
Did you tell him? You say, you better not tell me that it's going to be done soon, because I mean it. When you say that, I know you mean it.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Okay. For time consideration, what I want to do is go to Isaiah chapter 27. Now, don't grin when I say time consideration, okay? I really do mean this. But in Isaiah chapter 27, and I would like to begin with verse 9.
Do you know how many chapters there are between Isaiah 27 and Isaiah 66?
No.
Okay, that's fine. We're not math majors. We're Bible majors. All right,
no,
keep going.
no, we're not math majors. Believe you me. I keep telling people all the time, anything beyond 2 plus 2 equals 5, and I'm lost. I'm just totally lost.
Right.
Okay. Isaiah chapter 29. Instead of verse 9, let's start with verse 7. The prophet says, has he, that's Yahweh, struck Israel as he struck those who struck him? Now, there's a whole lot of striking going on, lot of striking going on. But he asked, has the Lord struck Israel in the same way or to the degree as that he struck those who struck Israel? Or has he, that is Israel, been slain according to the slaughter of those who were slain by him? In other words, the prophet and Yahweh is trying to get Israel to realize that while he has judged them, he has also judged the nations that judged them. In other words, he is saying, look, okay, the Assyrian may have struck you, but guess what? I'm going to destroy the Assyrian. Later, it would be the Babylonians. And Habakkuk, pondered and wondered, how can it be that a God that is far too righteous to even upon evil, to allow his ears to hear corruption, would use a nation worse than Israel to judge Israel? And the Lord says, Habakkuk, I'll take care of this. Your responsibility is to live by faith and to realize I'm going to put hooks in the noses of the Babylonians, and they're going to be led away captive. But you don't worry about that. You just worry about the fact that Israel, Jerusalem specifically here, Judah and Benjamin, they were corrupt. They needed to be judged. It was a righteous thing with God to judge them. So he said, Habakkuk, you don't worry about what I've got planned for the Babylonians. I'll take care of that. So that's the principle that is at stake here in Isaiah chapter 27. So he asks, has the Lord slain Israel as he has slain those who killed Israel? And it's absolutely amazing to me. The very first time I read this years and years and years ago, the answer to that is, well, yes, he did kill Israel in measure. How do you kill somebody in measure? Well, it has to do with he carried the majority of Israel off into captivity, and he saved the remnant. But notice, in measure, how did God kill Israel? That really, really got my attention. I mean, all the way back in the late 70s, perhaps 80s, to realize that Israel thought in corporate terms. God killed Israel by sending her away. That is a corporate national death. He is not talking about individual people dying and going into the dirt. That is not the focus of it at all. So, has he slain Israel as he killed those who were slain by him? Now, therefore, by this, oh, I got to digress for just a moment. I know I'm not bad about digressing. You'll just have to forgive me for the moment. I was disputing with someone on YouTube, and they said, well, Preston, the problem that you have is this. You are claiming that Paul was talking about the judgment of Israel by citing Isaiah 27 and Isaiah 59. But Paul's talking about the salvation of Israel, not the judgment of Israel. Therefore, you are wrongly applying this. And Thomas Ice made that argument with me years and years ago in a formal debate. The problem with preterists is all that you see is the judgment of Israel. When in reality, at the coming of the Lord, Israel is not judged, they're saved. Well, I responded then as I responded to this individual on YouTube. Your problem is the failure to see that the judgment of Israel would occur at the time of the salvation of the remnant. The salvation of Israel would occur at the time of the judgment of Israel. There is no temporal dichotomy, and distinction between these times. And so, and I developed this concept, by the way, and it's amazing to me, but not that I develop it, but I developed this concept extensively in my book on the resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, fulfilled or future. And I've got almost an entire chapter on it. I had a guy who is a PhD student. Okay. After reading that, he said, that is absolutely brilliant. I'm going, I thought lots of people realized that. But I've got to tell you, Daniel, the more I deal with people, the more and more and more I hear this dichotomization take place. Well, Preston, you're talking about the judgment of Israel, but the Lord's talking about the salvation of Israel that is coming. Those are not two separate events. They're two sides of the same sword.
Kind of like the resurrection. Well, I mean, you just alluded to it. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. Well, exactly. I thought it was the resurrection to life. Well, I thought it was the resurrection to condemnation. Well, it's both simultaneous.
Yeah. People like to create false contradictions, false dichotomies. And of course, the reason they do is because their doctrine is beginning to go down the tubes. And so they try to find any argument whatsoever to escape their paradox.
Right.
Okay, I've got to hurry here. Therefore, by this, by what? The sending away into captivity, the being slain. Therefore, by this, the iniquity of Jacob will be covered. This is all the fruit of taking away his sin. Now, this is the verse that Paul quotes in Romans chapter 11, verse 26 to 27. The Redeemer shall come out of Zion, for all Israel shall be saved. As it is written, the Redeemer shall come out of Zion, and he will take away their sin, for this is my covenant with them when I take away their sin. So here's Isaiah 27 that is indeed talking about the taking away of Israel's sin. It is indeed talking about the salvation of Israel. But watch, how would he do this? By sending her away, by judging her. And then he gets right down to the nitty-gritty. This is all the fruit of taking away his sin when, now watch this, folks, when he makes all the stones of the altar, that's the altar of the temple, when he makes all the stones of the altar like chalk stones that are beaten to dust, when wooden images and incense altars do not stand up, yet the fortified city will be desolate, the habitation forsaken and left like a wilderness. There the calf will feed, there it will lie down and consume its branches. When its boughs are withered, they will be broken off. The women come and set them on fire. For this is a people of no understanding. Therefore, he who made them will not have mercy on them, and the one who formed them will show them no favor. Now, what we need to realize is verse 11 is a people of no understanding. The one who made them will not have mercy on them. This is taken directly from Deuteronomy 32, verse 18 and following, a prophecy of Israel's last days. Not the last days of time, not the last days of the Christian age. And this is not a judgment on the church. This is a judgment on the temple and the city. Now, notice again, Israel's sin would be taken away when, temporal statement, when the altar is turned to chalkstone, and when the fortified city is made a ruin, and when the people whom he created is no longer given mercy. Daniel, I don't know how much clearer temple eschatology could be laid out than this. Obviously, the question would be, okay, when would the temple be made, or the altar be made into chalkstone, the fortified city be turned into a ruin, and the people whom he had created would find no mercy? I don't think we have a really tough time historically determining when that would be. It's not going to be the time of even of Antiochus Epiphanes, and here's the reason why. In the judgment of Israel at the hands of Antiochus Epiphanes, and according to Daniel chapter 8, 23 through 26, that period of time under Antiochus Epiphanes really was a judgment by Yahweh on Israel for filling up the measure of their sin. We need to recognize that. But the reality of it is, the city was not turned into a desolation, and the altar was not turned to chalkstone. It was defiled, but it wasn't destroyed. Matter of fact, Josephus, I think it's in his Wars, book 3, somewhere along in there, talks about the judgment of Antiochus Epiphanes. He talks about the fate of Jerusalem down through the years. And he says that Jerusalem had been besieged or desolated, 2 times. He said Jerusalem had been, quote, taken, unquote, 5 times. And here's the interesting thing about it. He mentions the time of the Babylonian destruction as being one of the occasions of Jerusalem's desolation. He mentions the destruction at the hand of the Romans, and the utter destruction of that time. But he actually says at the time of Antiochus, the temple was preserved. So here's a guy who knew Jewish history awfully well. And he says Jerusalem was not destroyed under Antiochus Epiphanes. Therefore, that's not Isaiah 27. Because in Isaiah 27, the fortified city would be completely made desolate. And Isaiah 27 is the time when the altar would be turned to chalkstone. And Josephus says the temple was not destroyed. It was desolated, or I should say defaced, defiled, desecrated is the better word, with the offering of the pig sacrifice on it. But Antiochus actually preserved the city and the temple. None of that fits. In other words, Isaiah 27 does not fit this description of Isaiah 27. You want to go ahead and throw in some comments there, Daniel?
Yeah, I was going to say...
I'm just kind of going on here.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's one question in the chat box that asked, how do we know that Isaiah is not referring to the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem in 586 BC? And a previous comment that was made was asking about I got the sense that they're asking about the ashram and the incense altars as being a reason why it would be talking about the fall of Jerusalem in 586. And I guess most simple response to that would be Paul cites this passage to talk about something that was yet in his future. And so while there may have been immediate application or whatever, the ultimate fulfillment of that, the word that is looking for it, is towards the destruction of Leviathan, the resurrection of the dead, the vindication of the martyrs, which would take place when the deliverer would come out of Zion at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So we know this is talking about something in Paul's future and is not restricted to an event before that because of Paul's application of it in his own day and age, being guided by the Holy Spirit to do so. So it's a Holy Spirit commentary or application of Isaiah 27, which is, if you look at a lot of the language, especially talking about John the Baptist, for example, that language of idolatry is one of the things that John would deal with was idolatry. And someone would say, well, there wasn't any idolatry, there was no idol standing in the temple.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you look at their statements about we have no king but Caesar, and even their hyperfixation on the temple, swearing by the temple instead of swearing by God, things like this, the temple very much to them was an idol. And their customs, according to the law, had become their idols as well, as Jesus pointed out in Matthew 15. So I think there's a lot, that goes into that. But, that, someone says their belly was their idol. Yeah, that's another passage. Yeah. But, the application of the passage by Paul is why we read it, the way that we do. So, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, excellent
thoughts on that, Don?
Points. Yeah, a very good commentary, very good comments. And I would add to that is the fact that, as I pointed out a few moments ago, Isaiah chapter 27 is a direct citation of Deuteronomy chapter 32, chapter 32, which tells us twice that it is a prediction of Israel's last days. Well, there's no way in the world to make the destruction of Jerusalem at the hand of the Babylonians Israel's last days. Was it a horrific, unbelievably bad situation? Well, nobody denies that. It was not Israel's last days.
No.
And that segues into what you were saying. When Paul quoted from Isaiah 27 and 59 and applied it to his coming future, immediate future, I would even say, that really ought to settle the issue. When Paul, throughout his epistles, draws on Deuteronomy 32 and applies it to his first century generation, then that means that since Isaiah 27 predicting the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 32, that's where we have to put that as well.
Right. And just to reiterate what you're saying about Babylon not being the last days, keep in mind that at least 2 times in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel makes known that the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had, the dream Nebuchadnezzar had, concerned the last days. And then he says in chapter 10 and verse 14, an angel tells Daniel, I've come to let you know what's going to happen to your people in the last time. So, and then in Daniel 11, to make this even more clear, it's said 3 different times that various people would rise up to try to bring about the end, but they couldn't do it because it was not yet the appointed time. And one of those people, of course, was Antiochus Epiphanes. So Antiochus Epiphanes, so Greece all the way back to Babylon was not pertaining to Israel's last days. They were events leading up to the last days for sure. Events that were guided to make that situation perfect, the fullness of times, but it was not Israel's last days. So those passages have to apply for a time after that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Great comments. And I've always loved those passages there in Daniel chapter 11, in which people would arise to try to bring in the end. They would try to hasten that end in. And the Lord said, no, at the appointed time, it will come. And in the Septuagint, that term or that time is the kairos.
Right. And
that's the Greek word that is used. Go ahead.
Oh, yes. I was going to say, so whenever Jesus comes on the scene in Mark chapter 1, he says the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And First Peter says in chapter 4 and verse, 17, the appointed time has come for judgment to begin with the household of God. Those are two very specific references, at least in my mind, to the prophetic timeline established by Daniel in chapter 2, chapter 7, and then chapters 9 through 11. So just
Yeah,
tack on there.
it's an interesting fact. No other prophetic book uses the term appointed time as many times as the book of Daniel. Now, some of those appointed times referred in Revelation, Daniel chapter 10 and into chapter 11, a good ways, pardon me, dealt with the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, that's because the events of Antiochus Epiphanes, trying to get my tongue in front of my eye here, and I can't see what I'm saying. But anyway, there's no doubt that those events were prophesied to take place. So yeah, they had their appointed time in God's calendar, as it were, to take place. But then over and over, as you just pointed out, have these references to the appointed time of the end. And you have those three texts in Daniel 11 of men trying to hasten the time, hasten the fulfillment. And the Lord just simply saying, it'll take place in the appointed time. And in this book that I'm currently writing, on the last day, the last hour, the last trumpet resurrection, I have an entire chapter devoted to that word kairos, because it is such an incredibly important word. When the Old Testament said over and over and over, the time will come, the time will come, and is pointing to the last days. So you have all of these references to the coming last days. You have all of these references pointing to the appointed time of the last days. And by the way, one of the more enigmatic references that we find, and this will give a little bit of insight into what I'm doing in my book on Daniel. And believe you me, folks, it has directly to do with temple eschatology, because as we're seeing right here in Isaiah chapter 27, God was predicting the time for the salvation of Israel. God was predicting the time of the resurrection. He was predicting the time of the destruction of Leviathan. He was predicting the time of the avenging of the martyrs and the coming of the Lord. All of these were for the appointed time. Well, in Daniel chapter 12, what do we have? We have the prediction of the Great Tribulation. We have the prediction of the resurrection. We have the prediction of the time of the end. Daniel chapter 12, verse 3. And it's all for the appointed time, verse 3 and 4. And Daniel was told to seal up the book until the time, the kairos, of the end. When the wicked will not understand, but the wise will understand, for knowledge shall be increased, and on and on. And then we have this really enigmatic reference to 1,290 days and 1,335 days. And Daniel, I know that you have, I certainly have through the years, I've read some of the most phantasmagoric attempts to rationalize, to justify, to explain the 1,290 and the 1,335 days. Look, pardon me, I've always appreciated Adam Clarke, for instance, a great commentator of the 18th century. He's still respected today as one of the greatest Hebraists. Guess what he did? He goes to Daniel chapter 12, tries to calculate the 1,290 days and the 1,335 days, and he comes up with the date of 1947 as the time of the end. There you go.
There we go.
Now,
one year away from making him a very good dispensationalist.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
but I mean, and scholar after scholar after scholar have struggled with this. The quote liberal scholars such as John Collins, he just looks at it fulfilled in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, as he does chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 9, which simply will not work. But nonetheless, these numbers, 1,290, 1,335, have really perplexed people. And look, I've tried to do math myself on this. And as we said at the outset of the program, I don't do math. Math does a job on me.
Mm.
I don't do math. I mean, it just doesn't work. And John Evans and John Noe as well have done actually some pretty good work on the 1290 days. John Evans disagrees with John Noe on that to a certain extent, but I appreciate the efforts of both men. Here's my explanation of the 1290 and the 1335. It would be fulfilled at the time when the power of the holy people was completely shattered.
Oh, yeah.
Bingo.
Right.
Furthermore, in the book of and the Gospel of John, Jesus referred to the last day 6 times. John 6:39, 6:44, 6:54, 12:48, a couple of other times. Okay.
11,
Now then,
11:24.
11, 25, and 26. Yeah. And we are assured this has to be the last day of time. I mean, after all, it's the last day. Well, that argument is really quite facile, I might say, because it fails to consider Daniel chapter 8 speaks of the last days of the kingdom of Greece. Well, so it's the last days, but it's not the last days of time. It's the last days of a designated period of time, the kingdom of Greece. Furthermore, and this is where it gets really critical, Daniel chapter 12 predicted the resurrection for the time of the end, which is the end of the 1335th day. In other words, the 1335th day is the last day, the day of the resurrection, and the resurrection would be when the power of the holy people was completely shattered. Now watch this, Daniel chapter 12 and verse 13, Daniel, go your way, for you shall rest with your fathers until the end of the days. Now I would try to pronounce the Hebrew of it, but I'd really mess it up, so I won't try to pronounce the Hebrew of it, Bakarit or something like that. What's the point? The end of the days is the end of the 1335. The end of the days is the time of the resurrection. The time of the resurrection, but would be when the power of the holy people is completely shattered. Anyone with a smattering of understanding of the significance of AD 70 knows that's when Israel's power was completely shattered. Basically, that's the end of the story right there. But that's the explanation. To me, that's the simplest explanation of the last day resurrection that can be found. The 1335th day is the day of the resurrection, when Daniel would arise on the last day of resurrection. Is there a problem? You see any fallacy in that argument, Daniel?
No, I don't think so. And I've used that line of reasoning before. I think that might have been about the presentation I gave when we first met at the Memphis Eschatology Conference in October of 2016 on Daniel 12 and the last day resurrection in verse 13.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's good. And so the whole idea of the last day, or the time of the end resurrection, as we pointed out before, comes solely from Daniel chapter 12.
Absolutely.
And when we see also, though, the connection between 1 Corinthians 15 and Isaiah 25, it makes all these connections even more cohesive. It really adds some color to it and just brings it all together, right? We have two key resurrection passages in the Old Testament, if not the two key resurrection passages. Yeah. Isaiah 25 on the swallowing up of death and victory, and Daniel 12 and the resurrection of the just and the unjust, both of which are in the context of temple eschatology, both of which are cited by New Testament authors as pertaining to the desolation of Jerusalem and the salvation of Israel. So when you have all of this evidence stacked up against the traditional view of the last day of the end of time, that view really doesn't make much sense in light of the Old Testament context. So I'll turn it over to you there. I know you want to get to Isaiah 66 in our last 9 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So we're basically going to leave Isaiah 27 hanging in the midst of the air, although there's a ton more stuff that we could get to. But yeah, let's go to Isaiah chapter 66, because I have to confess, this is something that I struggled with literally for years. Okay. I saw the connections. I saw what was being said, but I just didn't know how strongly to make the point. Isaiah chapter 66, the Lord said, "Heaven is my throne, earth is my footstool. Where is the house that you shall build me?" And he told them all the way back in Isaiah, this, pardon me, all of these things has the Lord made, that is heaven and earth. Where is the place of my rest? For all of these things my hand has made, says, and all those things exist. On this one, look, that is, look with pleasure and approval, on him who is poor and of a contrite spirit, who trembles at my word. In other words, the Lord is saying here, I don't care about lavish temples. I don't care about all the white marble, the gold, the silver, the precious jewels, the cedar. Now, had you spoken to any good, faithful Jew who had been up to Jerusalem to see the Solomonic temple, that would be stunning. The Jews or the rabbis of Jesus's day, and shortly after, those who had seen the temple, said, no man who has never seen the temple has ever seen a beautiful thing. That's the way to describe the first century temple. It's staggering, literally, to think about the amount of money that was spent on the Herodian temple. Okay, so here is this degradation of the value and the importance of a physical edifice. Now, let's not forget, ladies and gentlemen, in Acts chapter 6 and 7, and Daniel and I talked about its importance for understanding New Testament eschatology, New Testament theology at the close of last week's program. Stephen is standing in the temple, and what does he do? Now, look, folks, he's standing in the midst of that edifice that the rabbis said, if you haven't seen the temple in all of its glory, you haven't seen a beautiful thing. And yet, what does Stephen do? He says, heaven is my throne, earth is my footstool. Where's the temple? Where's the house you will build for me? I'm the one that built heaven and earth, for crying out loud. So by my hands are all of these things were made. Houses, no matter how glorious, temples, no matter how glorious, could not contain the Lord. And so, having said that, the Jews promptly picked up stones and killed him. Because, to touch on something that Daniel mentioned earlier, they idolized the temple. They literally idolized the temple.
Yeah, these going to take away our place in our nation, right? Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so the Lord says, and this is remarkable. I've said so many times, there's so many statements in the Old Testament that were literally at the time they were written, and as time progressed, became even more so. They were literally stunning and revolutionary. If we can get our heads, our minds, our thoughts into the mind of the ancient Jews, what would it have been like for us to have heard some of the things that were being read in the synagogues at the reading of Isaiah? So the Lord said, the one who kills a bull will be as if he slays a man. The one who sacrifices a lamb as if he breaks a dog's neck. The one who offers a grain offering as if he offers swine's blood. The one who offers incense as if he blesses an idol, just as they have chosen their own ways and their soul delights in their abominations. Now look, when the Lord said it's one of these days, it's going to be as if a man who kills a bull, that's a sacrificial bull. That would most likely refer to a sacrificial offering during Sukkot. That's when the most of the bulls were offered, a total of 70. So anyway, here's Yahweh saying, time is coming, which a man who offers a bull as a sacrifice is going to be the same as if he killed a man. What? No, Lord, you commanded us to offer these sacrifices. No, you're going to pervert my house to such an extent that your offerings. Now, what's ironic here is this is such a reflection, an echo of chapter 1 of Isaiah. Take away your offerings. I have no pleasure in them, So he begins the book by saying that Israel of his day, Jerusalem specifically even, of his day, had become so corrupt. They were such violators of Torah. The Lord says, I don't want your sacrifices. They're a stench in my nostrils. And all you have to do is read Amos chapter 5 to see an even more graphic description of this. I despise your feast days, the Lord said. Well, he's the one who commanded them. How could he despise them? Because of their corruption of them. Okay, so that's exactly what's happening in this prophecy of the depreciation of the Jerusalem temple. Now watch verse 4. So, as a result of what they were going to be doing, so will I choose their delusions and bring their fears on them. In other words, the Lord says, the time's coming in which your sacrifices will be the same as an abomination to me. And so I'm going to choose to bring on you your worst fears. Well, what could the worst fear of the Jew be? The destruction of their house. And notice what he says next. Because when I called, you did not listen. You did not hear, but you did evil before my eyes. You chose that in which I do not delight. Well, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Paul in Romans 10, verse 20 and 21, quotes this verse along with Isaiah 65, 1 and 2, verbatim, to describe Israel of his day and their response to the preaching of the gospel. When I called, you did not listen. I'm pretty confident Paul was right. I'm pretty confident Paul was not abusing the text. He saw Isaiah 65 and Isaiah 66 as predictions of Israel's rebellion in his day.
Yes. As did Stephen, as you've already pointed out.
As did Stephen.
Right.
As did Stephen. Go ahead.
And then the beautiful thing here, just to bring this all together with Isaiah 25 and Daniel 12 and the theme of resurrection, he says in verse 14, then you will see this and your heart will be glad. He's talking about the salvation, but also the judgment of Jerusalem, simultaneous. He says, and your bones will flourish like the new grass. And the hand of the Lord will be made known to his servants, but he'll be indignant towards his enemies. Their bones flourishing is a picture of resurrection. Yeah, there it is.
It's Ezekiel 37.
Exactly, yeah.
The valley of dry bones, living. Exactly. Yep. And it's not biological resurrection. And it gets back to that concept of Israel thinking corporately.
Right, national restoration. Yes.
National restoration. Okay. We don't have time to get into the verse that I want to, but let me read it. And let me urge people to give this some very serious thought. Now, I have to tell you, I pondered this for years and years, literally. I didn't know whether or not to literally or to actually make the application.
All right.
Isaiah 66, the sound of noise from the city, a voice from the temple, the voice of the Lord who fully repays his enemies. And I read Josephus, And Josephus tells us that 4 years before the fall of Jerusalem, and if anyone wants the specific citation from Josephus, I'll be glad to give it. Josephus says that for four long years prior to the Jewish war, a man named Jesus, a guy from the countryside, came into the city of Jerusalem. He would not talk to anyone. He would barely eat, barely drink. He went around screaming, literally screaming, "Woe to the city! Woe to the temple! Woe to the temple!" The people. Woe to the city! Woe to the temple! Woe to the people! 4 straight years of screaming that. The Roman ruler actually had him flogged, and Josephus says, flogged right down to his very bones. He didn't shut up. During the entirety of the war, he continued to do that. One day, during the actual war, he was standing on the wall. Woe to the city! Woe to the temple! Woe to the people! Woe is me! And a Roman ballistae took his head off, killed him instantly. I wonder if Isaiah 66 was foretelling that rather portentous, really strange guy. Was he a prophet? Was he a prophet? I don't know. We'll talk about this more next week. In the meantime, we are out of time.
Maybe a weatherman. The delay.
Hey, listen, folks, thanks so much for joining us here on Morning Musings. Yeah. So anyway, thanks for joining us here on Two Guys in a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. Daniel, great to be with you. With that, I'm going to say good night. God bless. What are your thoughts on that guy?